The end of this video for more exciting information about the Bass Pro Shop's Outdoor World Video Library. Among bass fishermen, the name Kevin VanDam is synonymous with high-speed power angling, hitting targets quickly with fast-moving baits, putting them in front of as many bass as possible, and scoring big when others come up short. Anglers watched in amazement during the 2001 Bassmasters Classic when Kevin was able to establish limits each day of the tournament, catching inactive bass with his supercharged style on jigs and soft plastics few people realized could be fished quickly and efficiently. Once known as the Kid from Kalamazoo, in this video, the man from Michigan gives us his insight on how he fishes bass fast with traditionally slow-moving techniques and presentations. So sit back, but don't relax, because when the 2001 Classic champion is pitching to heavy hitters, the action can be phenomenal.
You know, today we're fishing typical pitching and flipping water, real shallow, dirty, isolated cover and grass and things like that. But it's a technique that you can use for a lot of other things. You know, I'll pitch and flip sometimes in 30 or 40 foot of water. It's a great technique to get pinpoint positioning on real irregular deep structure. You know, if you're following a creek channel, all the little turns and things like that, you might miss them with a cast. But if you're watching your electronics and just pitching, you know, 15, 20 foot out of the boat, letting it sink down to the bottom, you're right there on the key spot. So you can use this technique for a lot more than just the traditional shallow cover. We catch a lot of them flipping real deep grass and you know, all types of cover, you know, bridge pilings. You can do a lot of different things with this technique. You know, there's really three basic casts that you need to learn for flipping and pitching. And each one of them serve a different purpose, but they're very important. Each one of them is deadly effective when you get into the right situation. When you want to flip is when you're in really heavy cover and real thick stuff and you really need to get pinpoint presentation, and this is when you're going to be the closest to the fish. I'm going to use my 7.5 foot flipping stick, and I'm basically going to work with as much line as I have hanging to my reel. And from there, you can pull out a handful, and that's all the farther that you're going to fish. And, you know, you can use a reel with a flipping feature or one without for doing this, but I'm pretty much going to be just working with this line, and I just run my hand back and forth, and I just swing it out there, and you can just set it into the cover just with the quietest presentation. And this is when you can be really deadly, but you got to be real quiet in the boat. And, you know, this is going to work best when it's really gnarly stuff. This is where you use the biggest line and the stiffest rod. I'm just going to get it in there and just really just work it back and forth. You have about a 15-foot range with this technique, and this is just the basic flipping technique. Now the next cast that I use is kind of the short range or the mid-range pitch. And you can either use your 7.5 foot rod or your 7-footer for it. I kind of let the cover determine which rod I'm going to pick up. If it's kind of lighter, sparser, thinner cover, I'll use my lighter rod, my 7-foot rod with that real soft tip on it. It just gives me a little bit better lure control than the big 7.5 foot heavy action flipping stick. But you can do it with both rods. And in this, I'm really looking at about the 30-foot range as being kind of the optimum distance. It's really good when the water's just stained and you're in real shallow areas where you can't get too close to the fish to spook them. And the best way that I like to do it is I start with the lure in my hand. It gives me a lot of good control to get the lure pointed in the right direction. And basically all I'm going to do is let go of the lure and lift the rod tip as the bait swings out there, just like a pendulum. And the key to this cast is keeping tension on the line through the whole cast. So I'm just going to drop the bait and then just lift the rod tip. And right before it hits the water, I put my thumb solidly and stop the spool and set the bait in real quietly. That's how you get the pinpoint quiet presentation. I'll start it like this, lift the rod tip, and stop it right before it, you know, it gets to the target. I can keep it real low that way. And if I add a little power to it by lifting the rod tip a little harder, you know, you can even slide it or skip it back underneath targets. And this is really good to about 30 feet. And this is probably the most effective and most used casting technique for pitching right here. deadly technique. The third pitching technique is probably the hardest one to master, and it's the most important one too. This is one that I catch a lot of bass with. It's my long range technique. This is the one you want to use when the water's clear, when it's extremely shallow, when the fish are spooky. It'll get a bait into really hard to reach places. I like to throw it under pontoon boats, underneath docks and things. You can slide it underneath willow trees this way. I can skip the bait right along the water real well. Lure selection is real critical when you're using this type of presentation. You know, something like a jig with a little bit bigger trailer tends to skip and slide better than a plastic worm. Tubes can be very good. If you're going to use a Texas rig plastic bait, it's very important with this to have the sinker pegged or to use a screw-in type sinker. I'm going to use a similar cast to the pitch, except I'm going to use the full length of the rod. The same thing applies. I want to keep tension on the lure all the way to the target. And what I like to do is just kind of loop the bait around or send it sideways. And it's kind of a sidearm cast. The same motion though, I'm going to keep that rod tip so where it finishes in the 10 or 11 o'clock position, so I can allow the bait to sink on a slack line. And once it gets in there, you want to watch it real closely. I want to lift the rod tip up, stop the spool, and set it in there real gently. I think when it skips like that into a target like that, the bass aren't necessarily spooked by it. And a lot of times in clear water situations, I think it excites them. As that bait comes sliding back in there. It's really not making a lot of noise, and it's a presentation that you can really get a long ways from the fish and get it into places where other anglers don't get any type of lure. These bass generally don't ever see a lure. Boy, another cast that is just really a variation of the pitch that I'll use a lot of times, especially if I'm in standing timber or in a real tight place where there's, a lot of bushes or thick willow trees, and I just can't get a sidearm cast to go in there, is I'll just do it what I call the little round and round or around the world type pitch. And I'll just take the bait and loop it all the way around towards me and then send it out there real low to the water. And that allows me to get it into some real hard to reach places. Like I say, usually around timber and things like that, around, docks or heavy willow trees. It's just another variation of the pitch that helps me get my bait into places where a bass might be when a standard cast won't work. One of the things about this technique is it's really important to have your reel set. And this is where you don't want to skimp when you're buying a reel for your pitching and flipping rod, because spending that extra money will get you a better, smoother reel that's going to make it easier to cast with. But basically, you want to take the weight of your bait and turn your magnets or your brake to off or the free position and set your spool tension first. And what I like to do is just put the bait out there, and I want it so it drops pretty free. I mean, it's going to fall real fast, and that way I can just turn the brake back on, and that'll slow that bait down, slow the bait down towards the end of the cast. All the brake or your magnets do is they control the backlash as the lure starts to slow down from wind drag or from skipping across the water towards the end of the cast. So you want those a little tighter and your spool tension a little bit looser, because you have to have it fairly free to get any distance by pitching. And it takes a little practice. The number one thing is to have a nice smooth motion with your arm. If you have a nice smooth fluid motion as you send the bait out there, it's basically a pendulum type swing. I just want to lift the rod tip to generate some force to get that lure to travel out there. And it's just a matter of keeping that lure low to the water, and then putting your thumb on the spool and stopping it right before the target, and just kind of lifting the rod tip, and it sets it in the water without hardly a ripple. There's one. Oh, that's a good fish. Right out of that tree. Oh, got the jig right in the roof of the mouth. That's where you want to hook them. Let that one go. Good fishing. The equipment that you use for pitching and flipping is real critical. For me, it's just more than one pole. I have to have several different rods, and the action makes a big difference, because, again, with this technique, it's all about the presentation and, having the correct type of rod, correct action rod, and line size and everything like that. Even line type makes a big difference. For pitching like I'm doing here, where I'm hitting a lot of targets that can be from close to far, you need a rod that you can control and get some good accuracy, and I think a 7-footer is the perfect rod for that. But it has to have some tip to it. You know, you got to have some flex to it. The tip helps you give the lure a nice soft presentation, and also when you go to pick up on it and check and see if there's a fish there, it has some spring to it, so the fish isn't feeling you pulling against him. So that soft tip rod is really critical. You know, if I'm going to get into a real heavy cover situation where there's, you know, a chance for a really big bass, then I need to go to, you know, even a heavier rod and heavier line. I pretty much fish with 20-pound as a starting point for pitching and flipping, and I go up from there. You know, if you're down at Sam Rayburn in Texas and flipping bushes, you might catch a 10-pounder, and you know that's a good place to throw 30-pound test. Now, myself, I've really come to use a lot of fluorocarbon for pitching and flipping the last couple of years. The thing about fluorocarbon is if you're in clear water, it's pretty invisible to the fish, so you can get away with a larger diameter. It's really low in stretch, and it's super high in abrasion resistance, which is very important because you're always throwing around a lot of this, you know, real gnarly stuff, rocks and trees and laydowns and things like that. A good bait cast reel is real critical too. You know, I mean, it's not any place to skimp is on your pitching or flipping reel, because you need something that's very smooth. It'll help you with that presentation to get that bait in the water real quietly. If you, you know, spend a little bit more on your rod and your reel and get a really good action, it needs to have that fast tapering tip, or what I call a real fast action. You know, it's important to have something that feels good in your hand too, and a lot of the rods out there have got butts that are just really long and kind of get in your way. You need something that's pretty maneuverable, and you know, you need something that's comfortable. You know, these low profile reels, I've got smaller hands, they fit me really well, and you know, I want a high speed reel too. And part of that is when you hit a fish out there a little ways and he's really moving fast, you can keep up with him. But the big reason is because you'll make that pitch, you'll fish it through the strike zone, and then you want to get it back in real quick and make your next pitch. So it just keeps your bait in the strike zone a lot longer. You can make a lot more pitches per hour that way, and you know, it's gonna translate into more strikes in a day's time. Ought to be a fish right on that wall. Yep, there's one. Not a very big one, but good solid fish anyways. One thing I really like to do when I'm pitching at especially sparse cover like this is I like to keep a good distance away from it. Let him go. And that's where your casting accuracy and practice in your presentation really pays off. Definitely the most important thing about flipping and pitching is the presentation. You know, it's a lot more important than the lure, and you know, it really goes into boat control and positioning and everything. But if you can stay a little bit farther back and still make a good, accurate cast with a real soft presentation, you're going to catch a lot more fish, especially you have the opportunity to catch 2 or 3 fish off of one target. There he is. He was right in the back corner. Another good solid keeper. You know, it seems like when it's real tough that tube is hard to beat. Sometimes there's 2 on the same dock. Sometimes there's a couple of them where they're, and I mean, that fluorocarbon right there, that's that Bass Pro XPS fluorocarbon. I just love it for pitching. I was right over the top of that steel of that boat lift right there. Just let that guy go. Really, the greatest thing about this technique is the overall efficiency of it, and you can really increase that a lot just by your equipment and boat positioning especially. You know, if you've got a really good rod and reel and you're real confident and you've practiced with it, you can just keep that lure in the strike zone. This is about making inactive fish react to the bait that's being dropped right onto their nose. If you can get it in there quiet without spooking them, they'll react to it. Boat positioning is a big part of that. You've got to be easing along nice and quietly. You're close to them anyways, so you don't want to be stepping on and off the trolling motor a bunch of times. I want to turn it down and keep it going at a constant speed. I like to work into the wind, or like we're doing here, the wind's going one direction, but the current is going another. You know the fish are going to be facing that way. So just try to think what the total efficiency of the spot, the presentation, everything. I'm going to choose my lures to be the most efficient. You know, a plastic worm falls down through the grass better than, say, a jig does. So a lot of times I'm going to use a worm for that situation. The water clarity is going to be real important. You know, a streamlined bait like a tube in a little bit clearer water will trigger more bites. It's going to fall a little faster. The size of the weight, you know, a heavier jig or a heavier tube, sinker, or whatever, is going to trigger more of those strikes in clearer water. In dirtier water, something slower and bulkier is usually better. So the overall efficiency is what's really good about the technique. You just have to choose the right equipment and, you know, boat positioning and everything to make it 100% efficient. You know, one of the things that I like to do when I approach a really obvious, good-looking spot like this, I mean, we've got a whole bunch of logs washed into a little corner here on the main river, and it's just a spot that has bass written all over it. I like to just work myself from the outside in. You know, I'll stand back just a little bit and kind of pitch to the fringes, and then as I get that kind of worked all the way through, I'm going to go right up in there and get in there really tight and, you know, try to hit all the little nooks and crannies and the little forks and the little shady spots and just try to cover every inch of it. But that way, if there's 4 or 5 fish, because a spot like this should hold more than one bass, you know, I've got a lot better chance of catching the other ones without, you know, spooking them if I work my way in. Your lure positioning is real critical, your presentation. You know, each pitch that I make, I want that bait to fall vertically right on the spot. And you know, I try to have my rod in position probably, you know, up at 10 or 11 o'clock so I can let it fall with an you know, complete slack line, and I'm going to watch that line on that initial fall. And that's when you're going to get most of your bites. But the rest of the cast is real important too. You know, how far do you work it back? You know, when I got a lot of limbs like this that I might not see, I'll swim it back all the way back to the boat through there and try to feel my way along. But if I can see that I'm, you know, away from the cover, or, you know, I pitch it along the main trunk like that, I'll let it fall, shake it a couple of times, and I'm going to put it back out there again in the strike zone. 99% of your bites when you're pitching and flipping are going to come when that bait is falling. So what I try to do is make it fall as often as possible and as much as possible. You know, if you're swimming that bait in and you get a strike, that tells me a lot about the way the bass are positioned on a given day. And you know, they may want the bait swam along. I'm always paying really close attention to what's going on when I do get a bite, what the bait was doing. Was it falling? Was I swimming it? Did I pull it over a limb? Was I shaking it? What exactly was happening? Because chances are, if you can catch one by doing it one way, there's more of them out there to be caught the same way. That's just about the mood of the fish on a given day. You know, one of the things that I always do when I look at a piece of cover like this is just try to analyze where the bass is going to be and make sure that my first pitch is in that high percentage zone. And, you know, on a lay-down log like this, it's usually at one of the forks or the junctions, or where the biggest part of the log is at, you know, the stump end, the big part of the trunk where it makes a little curve, where there's a little shade on one side. And, you know, what I want to do is make sure that that bait falls right in that spot. I told you that making the bait fall is really critical to catching these fish. I want the bait to drop straight vertical down into the spot. So I'm going to make sure that that first pitch to that target is going to be right on the money, and it's going to be right in one of those high percentage zones, because what you're actually doing is you're making that fish react. He's not there to feed necessarily, but all of a sudden he's minding his own business, and your bait comes in there. It doesn't make a splash, it doesn't make a sound, and all of a sudden it's like, boom, it's right in your face right now. They just react to it. That's why this is such a good technique after cold fronts. The fish are tight to the cover already. They're sluggish. They're really not in a feeding mood, yet all of a sudden that bait drops right on their nose, and they just react to it. They didn't want to bite it. They just couldn't help themselves, and that's why, you know, it's such a super technique. But the presentation is the most important part. I mean, it has to be perfect. It's got to go in there quietly, and it's got to be right on his nose. I mean, you can't be off a foot because the strike zone is that small. You know, this is a classic spot right here for pitching. You know, I could stand back and cast to this just as easily, but the thing that I like about pitching is I can really get that pinpoint presentation and really cover this little rock pile very thoroughly. I mean, the water's real dirty. As long as I'm real quiet on the trolling motor, I can get in there real close. But what I want to do is work down through there, and I'm going to drop my bait about every 1 foot increment through there and just really feel everything that's there, because a lot of times it'll just be one extra big rock out there that'll hold the fish that you might miss if you were standing back and casting. You just get a lot better feel, a lot better control, and you can work a small area a lot more thoroughly like this. There's one. Oh, God. Oh, man. That's a good one right there. One of the things that I like to do is look for real isolated targets like that. And there's a long, shallow bank here along this marsh with one log laying along it. Good fish. Let him go. There's a real shallow marsh bank right here, and there's one log laying there. You can see the stump there, and you know, it's just a perfect scenario. I'm going to pull up, and he kind of got me in that log. I'm going to have to retie, but I'm going to pull up and start pitching to something like that. And when you can't tell where the limbs and stuff are, it's going to take a few casts. You need to work through it and feel your way around. And what I try to do is get the bait to crawl down every limb. And with a jig like this that's got a good rattle, you know, I'll get it against that limb and just kind of shake it there and get that rattle to work. And that bass right there, it was about my 10th or 15th pitch to that same log. And I just got it up against the limb, and I shook it and got that rattle to work. And, you know, he just took it right off the limb away from me. Well, I'm going down it perfect, too. I can feel the jig just dragging right on the side of it. That's what you want to do on these underwater logs like that, is just kind of feel your way down there and try to feel where there's limbs and stuff coming over there. And just, I really like a jig for doing it, because you can really get that rattle. That jig will kind of hang against the edge of the tree, and you can just shake that rattle, and that'll get a lot of fish to bite a lot of times. There's a good limb right there. Just sit there and shake it. Pull along. Real good feel of it that way. There it is. Good fish. He just ate that jig. Good fish. Let him go. Chunk. I cannot believe, that's what'll amaze you when you're flipping sometimes, is how shallow these fish will actually get. You get a good dirty water situation like this, they hardly even have their backs covered sometimes. That's a good chunky bass, good flipping fish. Let that guy go back to get up there to his log. You know, one of the things when you're flipping and pitching that's real critical is to have a good pair of polarized sunglasses, because I'm just kind of going down this bank and I can see a few old pilings and stuff up there, but I just saw the outline, the shadow of a log laying there, and it's this deep, you know, but the water's dirty and those bass will get real shallow. So when I'm flipping, I'm always looking for anything irregular or any extra objects out there, you know, a rock, a stump, just anything laying in the water. You know, a lot of times it may be a piece of trash there that'll hold a fish, and that's all it takes to get a bite. You know, when you're flipping and pitching, shade is a real critical element to be thinking about. Usually the bass are going to be on the shady side of an object, but sometimes current or the time of the year can make a difference. What I always want to do is I'll experiment. I'll throw to the sunny side and shady side of an object and see where I get bit. If you get bit on the sunny side, it's a good time to continue to do that. I've seen that especially early in the spring when the bass first come up into bushes and things like that, where they'll just get right there and sit on the sunny side. But typically the best flipping days are days like this. I mean, there's not a cloud in the sky. The bright sunshine will put them a lot tighter to the cover. And if you got a shoreline that has a little bit of shady overhangs and things like that, you still might find some aggressive fish. But my first pitch is normally always to the shady side of an object. You know, one thing that I always look for is anything that'll provide some shade cover. There's just a little clump of flat pads right there, and that's just a primo spot. But if there's any kind of blown-in grass or, you know, a dock or anything that provides any kind of shade, You know, especially if the wind is kind of pushing into an area like that, it can be really dynamite. Bass, you know, they like to get underneath there just so they can sit on the edge and ambush the bluegills or anything that comes by. So always be kind of watching out for anything, whether it's, you know, a trash pile blown in on a river system, you know, sawdust from a flood, or blown in vegetation, lily pads, water hyacinths, things like that are all good things to flip. There's a good one. That's a little better fish. Yeah, finally. Boy, there was some trash down there and he got hung in that. A good solid keeper. Oh, that hook had him good. It's important to have a real strong hook for these tubes. This one's designed just for a tube, but that makes a big difference. A lot of people don't like to fish in areas where the wind's blowing in there real hard, but I've found that it can be dynamite. And you know, when you get in close like this, it just makes it a lot easier to get your bait where it needs to be, and that's real tight to the cover. So the other good thing about it is the wind will kind of cover a little bit of noise that you may make, and allows you to even get closer yet. So you can afford to be a little sloppier when it's real windy like this, and you're in your presentation, and it is harder to get it back into some of those areas, but it's well worth it. Oh gosh, there's a good one right there. I mean, there's a bigger one. Oh, no, he's just foul hooked. Thought he was a lot bigger than that. Still a good fish. Yes. You know, when the wind's blowing like this, you can get real tight. You can get a lot tighter to the cover, and you know, on a wall like this, it has a lot of different ins and outs to it. You know, that's what you need to get a good pinpoint presentation. You know, the wind's covering your approach. You can afford a little bit more noise, and you know, with the trolling motor and even with the splashdown, but it's just a lot easier to get a perfect presentation and drop that jig right down on them. And I'm going to hit every one of these pilings going down through here. There's one. There's two of them right in one spot. That's a good fish right there. Oh. If I can get a hold of him. That's a nice one. You know, with the wind blowing in there, a lot of times, a lot of people think when you're flipping that you need it real calm, but you know, the wind kind of activates the bass a little bit. The bait fish will be in there, you know, crawdads are kind of getting knocked out of those walls and stuff like that, and they're going to be more active, and those bass are going to be a lot more aggressive. So go back there and get back up by that wall. A jig is one of my favorite baits for flipping and pitching, and there's a lot of good reasons why. First off, it catches big fish. It's a bigger, bulkier bait. It imitates a crawdad real well. If you choose the right colors, you can imitate a brim, a shad. Just about anything a bass eats can be imitated with a jig. All you have to do is choose the right color, size, and weight for the conditions. Now, in general, the way I pick jigs is off the water clarity. And, you know, if I want a jig for dirty water, I'm going to use a darker color, black, black and blue, you know, purple, things like that in dirtier water. As the water gets clearer, I start to use colors more natural. Watermelon, pumpkin, brown, things like that. And if I know the bass are feeding on a certain type of forage, I try to match it. You know, when the bass are on shad, for instance, a white jig is hard to beat. If they're, you know, around bluegills and things like that, especially around the spawn when they're chasing bluegills away from their beds and things, I'll use a bluegill color or something with a, you know, a chartreuse tail on it, something a little flashier like that. So color is real important. The other thing is size, or the weight that you're going to pick, and how much you have the jig trimmed. A jig right out of the package is a big profile bait. It has a long skirt on it, and generally I'm going to trim just about every jig right out of the package. But the weight of it is going to control the fall, along with the trailer that you put on there. The warmer the water and the clearer the water, generally the faster I like the bait to fall. In cold water and in real dirty water, I want a bulkier bait that falls slower. So I'm going to use a lighter jig with a bigger trailer in a situation like that. And a lot of it has to do with just experimentation out in the water. If I pitch my jig out there and one bites it as I'm reeling it in or swimming it in, that gives me a good idea that I need to have the bait up off the bottom, and a lighter jig would be well in order. So if I have the bait where I'm shaking it on the bottom and that's when they're biting it, there's a good chance they're probably going to be really feeding on crawdads in that situation, and a heavier jig that gets down on the bottom and stays down there is going to be better. One thing that I always like with my jig, though, is a good rattle. I want that bait to make noise every time it comes in contact with cover. One thing you have to do when you buy a jig from the store and first take it out of the package is you really need to trim it. And I'm going to trim it to really match the conditions or, the profile that I'm looking for. Part of that can be done by the size of jig that you pick. There's little bitty jigs made like the little Bitsy Flip or the Bitsy Bug jig that are much smaller to begin with and give you a much smaller profile. And in real clear water, they can be dynamite. But, for a normal jig fishing like this, I take this full long skirt and I like to trim it so that it doesn't hide the action of my trailer. And I'll just take a pair of scissors and I'll pull the skirt real tight and trim it basically right behind the hook, somewhere between 1/4 inch and an 1/8 inch right up to the hook. The clearer the water, the shorter I like that skirt. And that way it won't hide the action of your trailer. The next thing that's real critical is the weed guard itself. If you're fishing in grass or vegetation, sometimes you can trim the weed guard down a little bit, to make it a little bit softer. But most of the time I like to leave mine all the way full because you never know when you're going to find a piece of wood or something to throw at, and you don't want the jig to hang up. What I do like to do, though, is I like to cut the angle of that weed guard down a little bit. And what I'll do is I'll cut it parallel with the hook right from the top there so it's nice and flat. And what that does is that stiffens those bristles up by shortening them, and it makes it a little more weedless. And as it's going through the water, if a fish sucks it in his mouth, it's less apt to keep you from hooking the fish. And that jig right there is ready to fish. Once you get your jig all trimmed, then you're ready to put a trailer on it. There's a lot of different types made. First off is pork. It's been around forever, and it's probably still the best in a lot of situations. In real cold water, I like it a lot. I think it has the best movement, and it has a real good soft feel and taste to it. One thing that I like to do to it is I'll just kind of split the end of those pinchers a little bit to make them kind of look like a crawfish. See that? Kind of just cut the end like that, and that gives it a little extra action and looks more like a crawdad. And again, you can use the size of your pork to control the rate of fall of that jig. Plastic trailers have become real popular in recent years, and they have advantages because they just don't dry out, and you can get colors that you just can't get in a pork frog. You can get flake in them, and they can be a lot flashier, and that's really when I like to use plastic, is to get some odd shapes and some odd colors. Smaller profile trailers like this are going to be real good on the smaller jigs, the little Bitsy Bugs and things like that. A big trailer like this Super Chunk is really good for swimming type actions. It has a big profile to it and a lot of movement. A big piece of plastic like this or pork will really slow down the fall of a jig. Real cold water, early in the spring especially, when you want a slow fall, a big trailer like that can be dynamite. If I'm swimming a jig, say around boat docks and things like that, a lot of times I want an action type trailer, so I'll use a twin tail like that, and I'll match the color to the jig. There's just about every color of plastic trailer made to match just about any color of jig. Anytime that I'm using a plastic trailer, I like to use some fishing glue and glue it on there. And the reason is if you're skipping that bait around docks and cover and things like that, it just keeps it up a lot better, and they'll last a lot longer for you also. There's the swirl. There it is. Oh, boy, I just swam it by that one, and he just jumped out there and ate it. Every day it's an experimentation, on these fronts and things like that. You'd think the fish would be unaggressive, and that one there, I kind of made a pitch all the way to the back corner and just swam it to the front, and he took it off the top like a spinnerbait. A tube is very good for fishing a little faster, and that's one of the reasons why I like it, is because not only can you fish it real slow and it's real effective, because those tails, the tentacle tails, will just kind of move even with the slightest twitches, but you can also hop it and move it pretty quickly. And why a tube is so effective, or I think it is because it's very erratic. When you hop it and twitch it a little bit, it darts, you know, real erratically. It never goes the same direction twice. It's not like a worm with a swimming tail where it just kind of does the same thing every time you pull it. A tube, you never know where it's going to go, and that's probably why it's one of my favorite baits. For pitching and flipping, without a doubt, a jig and a tube bait are the two things that I use the most. I love to use a jig for flipping and pitching, but there's a lot of times when you need to use some type of plastic bait. And there's a lot of different ones made, and all of them can be good for pitching and flipping. My favorites, though, are the more compact type of baits. A tube and a jig are without a doubt the baits I use the most, you know, when I'm out fishing. Other baits like these creature baits, they can be really good too. The best flipping baits to me are baits that are compact and a little bit bulky and have some type of action to them, whether it's cut tails like a tube or a little curl tail or twin tail on the back of them that are going to create some movement and push a little bit of water as the bait is going through the cover. Tubes are a dynamite bait for flipping and pitching because they have several qualities that really trigger the bass. First off, the tentacle type tails really have a lot of extra action, but the tube itself never really falls the same way twice. It's real erratic. It'll fall to the left, to the right, and that triggers those bass. They can't help but to bite it. It traps some air also, and the Denny Brauer flipping tube, like I like here, has a solid 1/4 inch head so that it's exceptional for Texas rigging. Now, creature type baits are another thing that I like to use a lot for flipping and pitching. A bulkier bait like this that's shorter, falls through the cover. It's easier to get in and out of bushes, to fall through grass, lily pads and stuff like that than, say, a long-tailed worm. And with these extra appendages, like this wild thing has extra wings and legs, it creates a big profile in the water and really helps the fish find it. This tube lizard, which is very unique too, it's not very long. It's hollow-bodied, so it'll trap some air. It still has the tube-type tail to it, and it has a good solid head for Texas rigging. The tube craw is along the same lines of a tube. It's very erratic in its fall, yet it has the extra pinchers on there to give it the realism of a crawdad. All these baits are going to fish exceptionally well in tight places, and they'll fall through thick cover a lot easier than, say, a lot of the bigger, bulkier plastics. Because they're hollow, they won't ball up on your hook, and my strike-to-land ratio is a lot better with these type of baits. For fishing these tube-type baits, there's several different ways that you can rig them. I use a Texas rig a lot of times, and it's really important to use the right type of hook and a super strong, sharp one. This Mustad Big Mouth tube bait hook is the hook of my choice. It's really strong, it's got a big wide gap to it, and you need that for these hollow-bodied baits. I'm going to Texas rig it and be sure that I get it very straight. If it's not straight, I'm not going to get that real erratic action out of it. These type of weights that I'm going to use is going to make a big difference too. These tungsten type weights are smaller for the same weight, and they are real hard, so they create more noise if you're fishing it around hard objects like rocks and wood. And that, I think, is a good thing. When it's bouncing around there, it'll make a lot of noise down there, a lot like a crawdad would. If I'm fishing it into real heavy vegetation, I'll use a screw-in type sinker. That way it'll stay connected to the tube itself, and it'll pull it down through the cover. Both of them are good ways to do it. It just depends on the conditions that you're in. Another head that I like to use is this new flipping tube head made by Strike King. And the unique thing about it is it's got a real strong, super sharp hook with the eye comes straight out the front and a good weed guard. And the way the weight is poured on it over the length of the hook, it gives the tube a more horizontal fall, and it's very erratic. It kind of swims down to the bottom. This is an exceptional head for skipping under docks and for fishing around areas where you're trying to imitate bait fish, and that's why I've got them rigged with a white tube here. If I see the bass are eating shad or bluegills and things like that, I love to throw this flipping type tube head. You always have to watch that line on that fall. I mean, it's what I'm doing every time. I make that pitch and I have that rod in position to where I can drop the rod tip to let that bait fall down, and you know, it'll fall 6, 8, 10 feet. And I got a pretty good idea as I'm going down a bank how deep it is. So if it stops before it should hit the bottom, say if I'm flipping in 3 foot of water and it stops 1.5 feet down, that's when I want to set the hook. If I see a twitch in the line, that's when I want to set the hook. If I don't see anything, I want to lift up on it, and you just want to check the weight of that lure. If it feels any different than what it does, just being out there in the water, it feels any different at all, a little lighter, a little heavier, anything like that, see if it's moving at all. then you want to set the hook again. But you want to pick up on it real softly, and that's why the real springy tip and the fast action tip really helps you. That way the fish won't feel you, and you can feel him. And when I set the hook, I like to just drop the rod tip, drop a little bit of slack in it, and then just really drill it home. And you know, get to crank right away and pull that fish right out of the cover. When you're fishing in real heavy stuff, it's really important to disorient that fish, to hit him real hard and get him coming your way, get his head on the surface, get him disoriented, and get him to the boat. Another good one. Yeah. Yeah. He's a good solid keeper. Who's, you know, right where he should be. Boy, when it's real slick and bright like this, it's real critical to have a superb presentation. And one of the things that I like to do, kind of in the off season or when I'm watching TV at home, is just sit there in the living room with a rod and practice my pitching, because you know, being able to drop that bait in there real quietly and get it right to the exact spot on the target when it's like this is critical. You know, the fish are real spooky right now. A lot of times they're suspended in the cover up a little higher, so they won't tolerate any splashdown, and it's real important to drop it right on their nose. So you want to just really be good. When it's like this, it's tough. You know, if you've got wind and current and things like that, that helps kind of cover a little bit of the splash up and you know, maybe some of the boat noise. So when it's like this, though, you can't make any mistakes. I've always had better success off dead trees or brand new green stuff in the water. You know, when the water, if you get a high water situation and it floods and you get, say, some willows in the water, things like that, the bass really get around that. But it seems like after a week or two, you know, when those leaves turn brown in the water, the bass kind of get away from them, and then when they fall off, it just gets better again. I'm sure it has something to do with the pH, but bottom line for me is if I see a good-looking tree laying in the water, I'm going to fish it. Oh, he's in that tree. Oh. I don't know if he's still on there or not. There's a good Christmas tree there, and I dropped it right down into the thick of it. I think he's still on there. Yep. Just keep that line tight and you never know. He's a good solid keeper. Who's, you know, right where he should be on that Christmas tree like that. I mean, somebody obviously planted in there and it came off the bottom and floated in there. But you know, one of the things you always got to keep in mind when you're going into an area that has a lot of cover, I mean, isolated cover like that, that's where the bass should be. But if you go down a bank and there's just 20 or 30 laydowns in a row, how do you know which ones to choose? You know, and you know, I don't always neither. But one thing that's real critical is to be watching that sonar. A lot of people think when they're flipping, you know, shallow cover, they don't need a depth finder. Well, I'm always going to be watching that depth finder, and I'm looking for a couple of things. I'm looking for bait fish activity, I'm looking for hard bottom, and I'm looking for a depth change. You know, if there's a bank with 20 laydowns, there might be a little stretch that's a little bit deeper, or maybe a little shallower. And you know, the first time is an experiment. If you can find them, you know, where they're keying on a little bit deeper water, or they're keying on that little shallower water, then you know what to look for as you go around to other places in the lake. But it's so important to be always keeping an eye on that depth finder when you're fishing shallow water. It's just as important as deep structure.
Kevin VanDam's success on the tournament trail is a testament to the effectiveness of pitching and flipping. Yes, VanDam is known for being a whiz with a spinnerbait, but he's just as deadly with a jig or soft plastic tied to the end of his line. If you add to your arsenal the tactics described in this video, you'll undoubtedly increase your catch when bass are tight-lipped and close to cover. But remember, as sure as Kevin's a classic champion, The fishing you encounter while pitching and flipping isn't always slow and tedious. If done right, it can be just as exciting as any good spinnerbait bite.
There he is. Oh man, look at this fish.
In the tradition of exclusive Bass Pro Shops video production excellence, we bring you the brightest stars in fishing, hunting, and outdoor adventure.
Little tiny hook, great big fish. Look at that.
The Bass Pro Shops Outdoor World Video Library is your key to enjoyment and success outdoors, whether your sport is fishing, deer, or turkey hunting.
Some people might want to watch a video that's just all catching bass, but to me, that's not helping you. That's not going to help you go out there and catch bass. Whereas these Bass Pro videos, they specifically go step by step, instructional, tell you what and how and what to look for.
The Bass Pro Shops video production team employs the latest professional technology to make your home viewing experience exciting, informative, and filled with the kind of action and detailed information that will guide you to a higher level of
We're here on
performance.
Polita Bend Lake. It's early February, and the bass are really just on a pre-spawn movement.
The more you watch, the more you learn. The more you learn, the greater your self-confidence in mastering never-before-seen techniques and tips.
That's a nicer fish.
They're going to tell you their secrets. They win tournaments because they find the fish and figure out a better way to catch the bigger fish.
You're hunting with the top pros in the field, Bob Folkrod, Jerry Martin, Larry Weissoon with black powder. He's one of the top pros in the black powder industry.
Nationally known and respected experts share their vast knowledge and secrets. Their goal and our goal is to do everything we can to help you learn through an upbeat, thoroughly enjoyable teaching adventure. This, no doubt, is what separates the Bass Pro Shops Outdoor World Video Library from the rest of the video crowd. Learn from the best, pros with a winning edge, who have proven themselves year after year.
That's a good fish now. That's a good fish.
Through trial and error, they have reached the pinnacle of success and are now willing to share that knowledge with you.
In real clear water like we have here, the only way you can catch those bass is to really downsize your presentation and really go to finesse.
Exclusive Bass Pro Shops award-winning videos are the most informative and entertaining products on the market today. Watch and listen. Step up to a higher level.
Well, that's what it's all about.
I definitely have improved my fishing and caught more fish because of the Bass Pro videos.
See the latest Bass Pro Shops catalog for the complete Outdoor World Video Library. And start your journey to be the best outdoorsman you can be today.
If you watch these tapes, you'll really learn something.